All right. Welcome. Thanks for joining our Tuesday night podcast. As always, we genuinely are glad for everyone joining in live and taking part in the podcast, being able to ask questions and being able to comment and be involved and get the live action point of this whole podcast set up. And tonight, this is kind of in a lot of ways, a follow-up to last week's podcast when I talked about learning more from the learner's perspective. And I had a kind of an interesting conversation with my boss yesterday. Actually, it might have been Thursday. And he basically, it was kind of one of those moments where he stopped. We were having a normal meeting, and he stopped. I'm new at this job, and so it's only like month 3. And so when I first joined, I kind of mentioned this a little bit last week, but like a lot was kind of dropped on my plate, a ton of responsibility and things that I've never done before, and I've never done at that scale. And so it was a lot to try and process and learn how to bring these streams down into an organized workflow and be able to actually do something instead of just, falling all over myself trying to explain why I can't. And so he asked me at the end of the meeting, he said, "So how are you doing?" And I told him that outright. I said, "Well, it's definitely been a heavy load. I feel like, things are starting to kind of mellow out a little bit, and I'm starting to get a little bit of a rhythm going." And I asked him, I said, "But I would like, some feedback, some advice." And I basically just said, "I know the company better than I do, manufacturing better than I do, and I'm totally open to your suggestion on how to do this better. And, based on what you've seen in my performance so far." And the first thing he said, very first thing, is he said, "You need help." He said, "You need to hire people." He said, "You cannot do this on your own. You have way too much on your plate. And if you keep trying to do this without help, you're going to fail." And so he basically said, "You have 2 recs open right now. Requisitions is basically you have 2 people you can hire right now." And so I said, "Cool, noted, awesome. I haven't made that a priority. I obviously need to." And so I'm that was okay. Next step. And he walked me through. There was like 3 things that right off the bat. It was kind of what caught my attention and why I'm bringing it up right now. And he said, "Okay, all right, advice, feedback. I have 3 things." And he literally gave me a list of 3 things, very, very practical, very, very well organized thoughts that I could take and literally apply to my own professional development, right? And so the reason why that's significant to me and for this podcast is that I can honestly look back at and name off many times that's happened professionally and in my Christian walk, where I've had conversations, most of them between you and me, and having moments where I'm either going through it or I'm at a loss or I just need to be corrected. I need, help. I need somebody to look at what's happening and say, "Here's what you need to do next." And so I'm still young because I'm in my 30s. So I can say I'm young. My wife, she's not as young as me. She's now in her 40s. And so I can say that I am young and she is no longer a youth. Biblically, we've had conversations about this before, but biblically, in the biblical days, you were considered a youth until you were 40. And once you were 40, you were now a grown man, or considered the elder. And so my point in bringing all that up is Pastor Ford is my elder. He's also my pastor. And so I would like to do this podcast a little bit differently than normal, where I'm asking a bunch of questions and you're just giving me answers, and we're talking about things and we're letting the podcast kind of take its direction. But given that this week is the first week of school, I think it's appropriate, not specifically to young people, but people who you have experience over. We'll just say it that way. And I'm not saying that from an age perspective, but there's a very interesting, I actually just started listening to Proverbs in audio. I have to commute here and there for work, and so I have been listening to the Bible and trying to work through things. Just it's better to sometimes different to just hear rather than read, and so you kind of pick up on things you wouldn't have normally picked up on. And so I've been doing that. And in Proverbs chapter 1, you have this statement before the Proverbs start. For anybody that doesn't know Proverbs, it's a list of proverbs. The whole book is just proverb after proverb after proverb, a statement, a fact, a wisdom about life, and an observation, an experience, and a statement made that is something that in the very beginning of Proverbs, he says, you need to study these things out. You need to understand what I'm saying. You need to put and invest time into these so that you can gain the same wisdom, is the point. But he says these very interesting words. He says at the very beginning that I'm giving you these proverbs, and he says their purpose is to teach people to live disciplined and successful lives, to help them do what is right, just, and fair. These proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. Let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those who have understanding receive guidance by exploring the meaning of these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise, and this is a key word for me, their riddles. And so I'm saying all that to open the floor and ask you to basically give advice to the next generation. And so this is going to be, and I do have questions. I'm not just going to like, hey, okay, now you take the floor, but because that would be unprepared of me. But I think it's interesting that he makes that statement, and then he goes on for 31 chapters about, or 32 chapters, right? It's 32 chapters, I think. 31 is the last chapter?
31.
Gosh, it's 31? Okay, 31 chapters, and basically you have a, no pun intended, proverbial handbook for young people and people seeking wisdom. And he does aim a lot at the young, but I think, as he says in this specific part of the book, he says, let the wise listen and become wiser. So it's not about being young or being unexperienced. It's just about gaining wisdom. So with that context, I want to start by maybe having a moment where you just give some observations from your generational experience of my generation, and we could say the following generation after, that are old enough to understand and listen. So what do you think of some differences that you have noticed between how you were raised and the generation you were brought up in and the generation you are watching and observe growing up right now?
Okay, so kind of at a starting point, I'm always, when particularly in these kinds of conversations, I hate stereotypes. There are stereotypes. It's not that there are no stereotypes. There are stereotypes, but I hate stereotypes when it comes to certain things like this, because it's, the classic thing is the old man saying kids these days, and so rather than doing that, the I would love to be young today, and I know a lot of people that, they think, that the good years are gone, that these are all the bad years, but, because I think one of the differences is that there's a lot of, the again, I'm trying to avoid, stereotypes and doom and gloom and stuff like that, because there's so many positive things that, hopefully we'll get to that. But, to start with, I think one of the major differences is that the dependence on, there's no real cross the board, because every time I think go to think to say something, I think there's other people that are in a different scenario, different situations. I would say probably, though, I could say, because I'm checking things off in my mind. Probably one of the most significant differences between my generation and your generation, but it's from the standpoint of growing up, is that my generation was more focused, and when I say growing up, I'm not talking about like kids. I'm talking about like, from teens into 20s. Um, the de- dependence isn't the right word, but the involvement in um, socially, having friends, just having friends, generally speaking, having friends. It's a lot more, uh, well, to describe it, or to describe it. So for me, having a girlfriend wasn't something that was difficult to achieve. And the reason why I say that is because I had a lot of friends, and there were a lot of guys and a lot of girls. And so, because it was a large group of people, having a girlfriend, out of that group of people, even if something worked out, or sorry, something didn't work out and we ended up breaking up, there would always be another one, there, because there was so much proximity to other people. And today it's all driven by, social media, and so a lot of people's relationships are spawned from social media, or work. It's usually, but even work's a bit limited, depending on the company that you're working for. There's a lot of smaller companies. You don't have like, tons of companies that have 400 or 500 or plus employees, so you're in a department, handful of people, in your department. There may be somebody there may not be somebody there that you might have an interest in. But outside of work, where do you meet people? Where do you go to actually meet people? It's quite interesting to me. When I was in Tucson, and I'm not saying these are good things, I'm just talking generally here. I'm not talking about Christianity. But before I became a Christian, there were, I could probably name half a dozen nightclubs, in the city of Tucson, which is only a couple 100,000 people, and then moving here, coming back to America, fully expecting, especially coming to San Francisco Bay Area, I figured there would be clubs everywhere and just lots of people in clubs, to find that there's none. There are bars, but they're more for people to go and drink. They're not like dancing and meeting people. It's not a social type of thing. And so I'd say that's probably one of the biggest differences, is that social aspect. And that says a lot, because you could break that down into smaller bits, is the idea of being able to have relationships, being able to maintain relationships.
You're saying it's like a less part of the life.
Yeah, it's not important.
Yeah.
It's not important. Often I go into a restaurant and you see people eating by themselves, which it used to be, going into a restaurant, seeing somebody eat by themselves is like, oh, how sad.
Or sitting at the same table and everybody looking at their phone.
Yeah, a couple even, couple, both on their phones, and seeing that and thinking, are they from work or what? So the social aspect, that bleeds out into all kinds of difficulties, not having friends. And this was something that I started to experience when I was pastoring in Liverpool, because Liverpool was like that. Liverpool, they had people that were, that were social. It wasn't like there was nobody that was social, but a lot of people that came into the church, they weren't social. And so they become a Christian and they're meeting new people in the church, but the conflicts, and the difficulties of being able to interact with people, and be able to, when there be conflict of some sort, it's like, forget you, I don't want to talk to you anymore because we have a conflict, and because I was even at that time, because I was only in my late 30s, but a lot of the kids that were coming in, I say kids, but they were 15, anywhere from 15 to 18, 20 years old, coming in and just not being able to be social, and just get upset and, over some silly thing that was said.
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, not used to interacting with people. You know, it's this, there's this expectation level, you know, that people are going to treat me a certain way. I'm going to be treated a certain way because they didn't have that development growing up of, you know, having friends, you know, as teenagers, hanging out, doing stuff. So they're not, you know, it's, and I think a lot, you know, putting things into its proper perspective. When I was younger, drugs were not that popular, being involved in drugs. When I was in high school, in Tucson, there were the cowboys and the jocks and what they called the freaks. And the freaks were the ones that did the drugs, not the cowboys or the jocks. They didn't do drugs, but the freaks did. But the freaks was like, you know, there'd be this big crowd of, you know, jocks, big crowd of cowboys, and then this little small crowd of freaks, you know, probably half a dozen to a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were all always together. You know, they would be the ones that were always far out into the field and smoking pot or whatever. But it wasn't popular, you know, to do that. You know, and then when I started getting in after I graduated high school, that's when I started getting introduced to the drug culture. It was after I had already graduated high school, but during high school, there wasn't a lot of people taking drugs. So there was a social aspect, you know, because after I started taking drugs, that's when I became antisocial, because it wasn't, you know, I would go to clubs, but it was always going to clubs because I wanted to meet a girl, you know, and so that was the whole reason there. But before all that, you know, I had friends, and like I said, you know, growing up, I had friends, and so boyfriends and girlfriends were easy. But once the drug thing started coming into play, the social aspect began to go down, because people they don't get together, do drugs, and talk. They get together, do drugs, and then, you know, dissolve, basically, you know, or it's like anything, getting drunk or whatever. Now, granted, there are some drugs, yeah, I know, you know, there are probably people out there, oh, there's certain drugs, yeah, I know, speed and meth and things like that. But still, the whole idea is, and you're looking for an experience for you. You're not looking for an experience with people. You're not looking to enhance your people relationships. You're looking to, you know, for your own, you know, well-being or escape or whatever. So that's a main thing. I think that's a really big thing, is the social aspect, which has a lot of negatives to it. You know, there's a lot of bad factors, because without having a lot of friends, you don't develop as a person. You can't develop as a person in your own, you know, living in your own head, because your own head is just your own head. You need input from the outside in order to be normal. You can't be normal without outside influence into your life.
What else? I'm talking about differences, things that you can observe. You know, it's funny. I've heard said, you've probably heard this before, when people say that, you know, people don't change. People have always been the same. They'll always be the same. And I think that they're like fundamentally that might be true, but like when you read the Bible and it like mentions the end times, I notice there are these changes that are mentioned that are going to happen. Like in the end, perilous times will come.
Yeah.
And so it does note a change in the times, right? Something's going to change, but it also says men will become lovers of themselves, right? Men will lack natural affection. So there is going to be some notable changes from generation to generation, obviously. And so, you know, thinking in that context, now we're talking more drilled into the biblical worldview and like what the Bible says is going to happen from generation to generation. What have you noticed in that context?
From the biblical standpoint?
Yeah.
Or,
yeah, exactly. Like, you know, we often talk about this being, we are in the end times. And so have you noticed changes in, you know, kind of like what you're talking about, this way more self-focused, and there's, you know, a lack of real, regard or attention to other people. Yeah. You know, what else is like in that same vein that you've noticed or that you could call out right now?
Like, you know, like what the Bible says about the last days?
Yeah.
Okay. So in that context, yeah, I would say, you know, a lot of the things that you just said, but they're all, it is the social breakdown in general. It's probably, it's, I'm talking about it generally, but it works in so many different levels. The issue of families, families, people are not, they're getting married later, and in life, they want to pursue personal goals, and then when it comes to actually making a decision to settle down with one person, it's like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that, because now I'm making money and now I've got some credibility, and so I want to, and so one of the, it's not talked about much anymore, but one of the number of years ago, one of the realities was women getting involved in careers, once they started getting involved in careers and then putting off having children, and then realizing that now that they want children, they can't even have them, because they're waiting until their late 30s to start having kids, and they don't, for whatever reason. And then all of a sudden, you start into your 40s, and it's like, now you're a high risk pregnancy, and so, oh, do I really want to get pregnant and have a high risk pregnancy? And and so there's all kinds of like, again, the whole social breakdown that causes all that. And so you have this going on. So you have a generation of people, and that's why I really want to talk about the more positive things about this generation and this time, because there are so many. I would like I said, I would love, I'm looking at my life now at 64 years old, and I'm thinking I still have time. I'm still going to enjoy the things that are going on, but I'm, everything right now, there's so many breakthroughs, in technology and things like that are going to really make for, I grew up on Star Trek, and all this high tech stuff and everything, Isaac Asimov and all these authors talking about the day when things will be very convenient and very easy, and this is just the beginning of it. It's like, when you walked into my house, and I can tell, my Echo, turn on the lights, set the blinds at 25%, and things like that. And these things just automatically happen. And, and it's cool, it's cool, it's convenient, and it frees up time. And especially AI. I mean, AI has freed up so much time for me, that I would love to, this is a great time to be alive. And I think, I think that there's a I know financially it's a little bit more difficult than it was when I was younger, but it's not as bad as when I lived in England. I can tell you that. We had to think twice about going out to eat when I lived in England. The disposable income was much lower, much lower. And so, we thought, oh my God, gas is $5 a gallon. Yeah, well, when I was in England, gas was $7 a gallon.
Really?
And that was 20 years ago.
Dang.
Yeah, that was 20 years. It's actually gone down. It's like $5 a gallon now. It's actually gone down. It's almost the same as
in
us.
Oakland, Oakland, England. That's hilarious. Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm not. I didn't necessarily clarify this, but differences doesn't have to be negative.
Yeah. Well, that's so it's not so much that there's a that how to having a hard time trying to come up with the words to describe what I'm thinking, but the idea of not being able to see that, and that's, so for me, being older, and this is why I'm not a big fan of the stereotype, all kids these days, because I was kids these days, at one point in my life, and there were adults over me who were saying kids these days, talking about people like me, because I really wish that I had, I was thinking about it when I saw the title for the podcast. I started thinking about the idea of older people and what they would say to younger people. and thinking, oh, there's so much that I could say, that not so much, it's not a thing of don't be like me, and having made a bunch of mistakes. I did a great job, thanks to Jesus, saving me and working in my life. I have done a great job at living life. I have enjoyed life. I have no regrets whatsoever, and I can leave this planet now having complete contentment for everything that has happened in my life throughout my entire life. I'm glad I only had 20 years of insanity and not 40 or 60 years of insanity. But I'm glad I had that so that I could have that point at 20 years old when I started making decisions that I made, from the wisdom of God, like what you said about Proverbs, is to make you wise. That's the thing about the Bible, and especially Proverbs, that there's so much wisdom in it's when you understand that the wisdom is general, and you begin to apply that general wisdom into the specifics of your life, it's fantastic. But so there's a lot of things I could say from that standpoint. But looking at this generation, and there's been a lot of things said about this generation, Gen Z, and millennials, and that all of those kinds of things that have been said about not being able, like there's that classic YouTube from years ago that about the woman who's in there having an interview for a job.
Oh yeah.
And she starts telling the boss, how the company should be run, and he's like, I haven't even hired you. She says, I quit. And he said, I haven't even hired you yet. This is the interview.
Yes.
And so all of that, you could talk about those kinds of things, that just the lack of understanding of how the world really works. But like I said, that all goes back to the social aspect of things, of not having had enough social interaction, because if that was true and you actually had an interview like that, after the first interview, okay, fine, but after 20 interviews and you can't get a job, and now you're hurting because of it, you're going to learn those kinds of things. You're going to learn, I can't be like that, I can't act like that, I can't live like that. And so there's I think a real potential, an unrealized potential for this generation. I really do think that that's the case. And a lot of it is because, okay, so here's another thing, is the paying attention to religion, just religion in general. It's just, the term none, NONE, that when you're filling out something and asks you about religion, during my time, people usually would put down a religion of some sort, either Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or, Muslim or whatever, everybody kind of had some sort of, religion that they followed. Whether they followed it closely or not, is another story.
There was some kind of association.
It was there, there was an understanding, of religion, in general. And so that's changed. And honestly, I don't think that that's really bad thing, to be honest, from my own personal experience, because I was a nun, NONE at, by the time I was 20.
Yeah.
Because I gave up on the idea of religion at a very young age. I didn't have my parents, we didn't have any religion in my family, but I knew people, and I did go to some meetings, there was a summer basically where I went to church, played softball with this church group. And so I started going because I made friends with them. And so, they invited me to church. So I would go to the church, went to a church camp, different, experience, more than anything else. And realized, that's a whole nother, it was like a little niche group of people that just had disconnected themselves from the rest of the world, and they couldn't They couldn't interact socially with the rest of the world because of their religion. And they didn't understand that the way they were behaving, hypocrisy in the way they were behaving. I had a conversation with somebody the other day, yesterday, talking about this very thing, is the idea of, people from that environment were doing things that I wouldn't even do, as a non-Christian. I wouldn't do. Just attitudes, behavior, towards other people, to be able to be cruel to other people or cold-hearted to other people, and in the name of their religion, it was identified with that, and it was like, man, if God's involved in this, I don't want to be a part of it, kind of a thing. And so I think that idea, that's another thing that's different, is the adherence to religion. There's not a lot of hypocrites anymore. There's a lot more non-religious people than there are hypocrites, because they have all seen, and have realized that, if my choice is between being not non-religious, not believing in God, or being a hypocrite, I think I'll not believe in God. So I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot less adherence to, or respect for. It's probably a better way of putting it. Respect for religion.
So let's kind of go the direction of, advice, and maybe you can take it from that angle of, if I were young, I would.
Mm.
And in the context, because you've mentioned positives, and you've mentioned some negatives, and you've mentioned, observations from your perspective, but then making that statement in the very beginning, I wish I were young now in this time.
Well, yeah.
I'm not, I
Yeah.
kind of get your point. Like, it would
Yeah.
be the advantages you would have at that age is, I think, what you're
I would love,
communicating.
It's not so much I wish, because that's not true. I don't wish I would.
Yeah.
I would love to be young in this day and age.
Yeah. Fair.
And for two reasons. One, it would obviously be a second time around. And so there are those benefits, if something magic could happen and all of a sudden I'm 20 years old. And
with the mind that you have now.
Yeah. And I mean, I would definitely be more what I am now, in terms of my so at a lot of levels, I would be if I was single, so let's say, I'm in my teens, let's not say, because I got married at 21, but before I got married, so as a single person living in this time, I would definitely, I would be on 10 about everything in my life. I wouldn't put things off. I wouldn't just say, "Oh, I'll wait till later," or whatever. I would just do it. Like, I would probably go to university. I didn't go to a university because it was kind of late. I was 20 when I became a Christian, and so the idea of going to university would have put me at 24 years old by the time I got a 4-year degree, and 26 if I got a 6-year degree. And so it's like, I really don't want to, that ship has sailed in a lot of ways, and I'll have to make up for that along the way, which I did, because I eventually got to a place to where I could get any job that needed a bachelor's or equivalent experience, and then I was able to do that. So there was no loss as far as that went. But I would definitely be more engaged in the world that I lived in. If I was a young person.
Describe engage. This is actually jumping into another topic that I am going to do probably in the next week or two for a podcast, but talk about that idea of being engaged in the world.
Well, it wouldn't just be, I wouldn't be doing it for me. It wouldn't be, I'm going to get a job so I can make money, so I can buy things, so I can go places, so I wouldn't do that. I would utilize the opportunity, because this is what I do now, and I would utilize the opportunity to be able to help other people.
Mm.
because there's, having, even though I only was non-Christian for, technically speaking, from 16 to 20 years old. I mean, before I was 16, I didn't have a driver's license. I couldn't really go anywhere. I was, just hung around my neighborhood for the most part. And then once I got my driver's license, I got a job, and then I started, moving out into the world. So it's only like 4 years that I wasn't, I wasn't that involved in the world. But and I wasn't, I didn't, I didn't become money oriented or anything like that. And I'm talking about it in terms of degrees. I'd be more engaged because I would want more people to know about Jesus. Because when you're younger, and you have a great audience of people that you can talk to. And I remember, I think at the time, trying to remember exactly how old I was. It was when I think it was when I was here, I was 50, and there was an 80-year-old guy who was sitting in a mall. And he came and he sat down and he just started engaging me in conversation. And I told him I was a pastor and that, I believed in God. And he's like, oh, one of those. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, oh, he said, I gave up on that a long time ago. And then he started coming from the standpoint of, when you get to be my age, you're not going to believe in God either. That was the way the conversation was going. And I said, what's funny about this is that you don't even know who I am. You've never met me. You don't know who I am, but you've pigeonholed me into this thing. I've been doing this since I was 20 years old. And I was a non-Christian and became a Christian. You got it all worked up in your head that I was in this isolated, sheltered environment all my life. I knew nothing but religion, and somewhere along the way, went to seminary, and now I'm a pastor, and it's just a vocation, that I feel obligated to do. And as I started explaining this to him, he completely changed. He was like, because at the beginning it was, I'm smarter than you and you're stupid, because you believe in God. And then I started asking him questions, engaging him in things. And it became very clear that he didn't really know anything. I mean, he didn't even really have a trade. He just has been alive for 80 years, and that automatically means I'm intelligent because I'm 80 years old. And he said, I misjudged you. He said, and I'm completely wrong about this, because I'm telling him, I said, I'm 50 and I know this. You're 80 and you don't. And that kept happening. In our conversation, I'm saying, I know this and you don't. I know this and you don't. I know this and you don't. But you sit down at 80 years old and you're ready to teach me about life. And all you've done is live for 80 years. That's the only thing you've done in life, is live for 80 years. And it's like, and it was like so sad, But my point in that is that when you have wisdom, it doesn't matter your age. You can be young and move up, in people. The problem is when you're older and you're going down, you're not talking to people that want to learn. You're not talking to people that are wanting to actually grow, until they decide, I really do want to do this. I really want to, but it's not a natural course of events. And I wasn't either. And that was, the reason why I'm saying that is because that's one of the things that if I could be younger again, I can honestly say I would listen more to older people. I would listen more to what older people say, because it isn't a question of whether or not somebody's intelligent or not. It's a question of, sometimes people have had experience at things, and you can learn from them, and it's not just a respect for your elders. It's just the idea of being able to learn from people that are older than you. And I didn't actually start doing that until after I became a Christian. I didn't. I had teachers, that I listened to, but that was kind of, you had to, you're in school, you have to listen to your teacher, you have to pass the courses, I have to memorize the information. But after I became a Christian, I became hungry to learn. I wanted to learn about life. And so that's what I began to do. And so what I'm saying is I would do that even more. If I had it to do over again, I would do that even more. I would engage through communicating what wisdom I know, and also receiving wisdom, and just becoming a sponge, to learn from other people, because it's rewarding. You don't have to do the hard work, because they've already gone. That's why I love the idea of apprenticeships and mentoring, that kind of thing, the one-to-one, because the learning curve is so much shorter. You go to school, and that was one of the things about going to university that was overwhelming to me. It's like, I don't want to learn any more English. I don't want to learn any more history. I don't want to learn any more geography. I just want to learn technology. That's all I cared about, was technology. I didn't care about anything else. And then I became a pastor. It'd been nice to know a lot about history and geography. I went to Spain, and I needed to learn another language. And so to learn another language, you need to know what it means to conjugate. You need to learn what a conjunction is. You need to learn all this English stuff, but I thought, I'll never need this ever again. And here I am trying to learn, and my wife loves English. And so she would say, oh, that's a such and such. And she would, say these terms. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means, let alone do it.
Your wife has become my English teacher. I'm always sending her titles and thumbnails and stuff. She's always saying me, up, you messed up here, up, you messed up there.
Oh, spelling stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's horrible when it gets through, though.
Yeah. And then I read now all the time. I'm listening to audiobooks and learning. And it's like, even at 64 years old, there's still so much to learn. And honestly, I think I think if there probably has been studies done, but one of the things that, because my Clarissa's a nurse, and one of the things she said, because she talks to you, how do you keep going, and these older people that she talked to, because she used to do that home health thing, and all of them same thing. Well, I read, I engage with the world around me. I'm not just sitting at home watching TV and just zoning out. And so there's so much, there's so much to it. You don't even need to go anywhere to get that kind of stuff. You can get it right where you're at. You don't, I wish I could go on vacation and see the world. And I know people that, I've got to go see Europe and this and that and the other thing. And, and it's funny. I lived in Europe, and you could hop on a plane, like hopping on a bus, it wasn't expensive. I could fly to the continent, from England, which is, all of, anywhere from France on. And so I went to France, I went to Germany, I went to Lithuania, and so I'm going to all these places. And after a while, it's like, I'm in France, and it's like, what did you think of France? And it's like, it looks like England. It doesn't look any different. The buildings are all old, all made of sandstone, and I went to the Champs-Élysées, and it's like, big deal, because I've been all over, I've been all over Europe, and it's like, it's cool. It's not that it's not cool. It's not, cultural experience, but you know what? I just like going to the beach. just go to, Florida or LA, whatever, San Diego.
So let's spend the last 15 minutes or so with sorry, we got a question in. Sorry, I'm going to go ahead and read this, but I'm going to bring it closer to my face so I can see it. The question that's come in is: would you still care about today if it weren't for Christianity, or would you still be learning today if it weren't for Christianity? Or would you still be in your IT world as deep as you were before Christianity?
Oh, that's a hard question to answer, because I don't know where things would have led for me. I doubt very seriously that I would be as broad spectrum as I am now if it wasn't for Christianity. Because Christianity forces you into relationships with people. Not that you will give into that, because there are people that have been Christians for 20
Yeah.
years and are still fighting against, building relationships with people, and they will probably fight all the rest of their days, and never know Jesus really. It'll always be, Jesus will be nothing more than a concept to them, but definitely learning. I wouldn't talk about being deep. I wasn't deep into IT. Um, it was just a natural bent. I liked IT. I liked technology. I don't know if I would have pursued that course because I had more employment in IT earlier in my life than I did later in my life, because later in my life I was just doing drugs and just trying to survive. And so I went from, my dad was a good contact for that kind of stuff. I got entry level jobs in IT companies. But then as I started doing drugs, I got fired from those jobs, and the only kind of jobs I could get was working in places where people got high on the job. And so that was a very limiting factor for me. So I don't know. I can't honestly say. I've always said, if I didn't become a Christian, I probably would have just done drugs all the rest of my life. But I'm not positive that that would actually be the case, because I really was trying to get out of that situation. I was looking for creative ways to, grow myself, but still party. I was trying to find a way to do both at the same time rather than just party, because I was tapering off on drugs. I had done hard drugs. I'd done LSD. I'd done crystal meth. I'd done all kinds of heavier drugs. But I was getting to the point where it was like, it didn't do what I wanted it to do. I took mushrooms and things like that because I wanted to have the experiences, and my brain doesn't work like that. I know people that friends of mine and stuff, they see things and stuff like that, but my brain doesn't work like that. My brain is too analytical to make up fantasies, trying to, oh, the walls are breathing. It's like, no, they're not. The walls aren't breathing. I can't see properly.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, so for me, the idea of, turning something into something wasn't going to be the case. And so it was like, I need something more challenging to life than just taking drugs. So I don't know if I would have stayed there forever, because when I became a Christian, I wasn't looking for a way out of drugs, because I thought I was already coming off of them. I already thought I'm going this way, because I'd moved to another part of town, ditched all my old friends. I was planning on making all new friends, and the partying was just going to clubs and drinking, and I wasn't doing drugs so much. Part of that was because I was getting in trouble a lot, because of the drugs. It would get me, arrested. I'd be acting stupid and driving stupid, and get arrested because, almost knocked that over. But because of that, it was like, this isn't the cost to benefit wasn't working very well, and so it's like, I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. But yeah, no. So I would say, I don't honestly, I can't really honestly answer that question. It's just Christianity opened my eyes to the world, and I can honestly say that no matter who the person is that becomes a Christian, if you become a Christian, your eyes are opened, not automatically. Let me put it realistically. I've been a Christian for 40 years, and so it's just not right across the board, and it happens to everybody, because there's a lot of people that, like I said, Christianity doesn't even benefit them anymore. They're still just as messed up in their psychology as they were before they became a Christian. But it opened my eyes to the fact that the world was a really big place. And so when I went to England, and then I was, like I said, going to Germany and France, and I was meeting different people with the intention of telling these people about Jesus. And so it was very interesting, because I had to understand in order to cross cultural boundaries, which Christianity crosses all boundaries. There isn't any boundary. I've been to China, and I don't speak other languages. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but I don't speak other languages. And so if the people are not English speaking, that doesn't, I pull out my, Google Translate. I was in China. I was having a conversation in the hotel I was staying with one of the people working in the breakfast area. And I got to know her over the years, and I would come back. I wouldn't see her for a year. I'd come back and I had my arms wide open and she'd come around and give me a big hug and stuff. And it was like, I was just meeting people and getting to know people and engaging with people. And, I wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for becoming a Christian, because I just didn't see the world through that kind of lens. I always saw the world as, it's about me, what I'm going to achieve, how is life going to benefit me, because I didn't have an afterlife. I didn't have an understanding of eternity. It was like, I've got this much period of time, and so I'm just going to use it all for myself. So yeah, I don't know that I would throw IT in the middle of there, but definitely my desire to learn more broadly definitely was because I became a Christian.
So what advice would you give? We got a few minutes left here. What would you say would be like some key points, you know what I mean, that you would say like, this is wisdom from my experience observing this generation that's specific to this generation, things that if you take these on board, it really help you, really change your life.
As
really,
being, I don't know at what point you stop calling it youth. I think it's hilarious. I was fully expecting your wife to jump in here and say, I'm 41, he's 39, and that there's no difference between us. But she hasn't done that, so I think she's just being gracious.
She's probably just gotten used to it.
Yeah, she's probably like, I've heard this so many times.
Yeah. We've been married almost 15 years. Yeah. She's heard it a few times.
But I would, I think the most important element, if there's anything that I could communicate to younger people, whatever that number is, I don't know, is don't be so focused on the problems in your life. I see so many people today that's all they think about. And what has happened as they're getting older, what has happened is they have reprogrammed their body chemistry that they're only happy when they're miserable, and they're no fun to be around. There's no, it's, hey, how you doing? Oh, well, I had this problem, and I got this problem with my thigh, and I had to go to the doctor, and the doctor said it's because I have to do this, and, I need to exercise, but I can't exercise because, I've got to work so many hours, and you just on and on and on, all the complaints and gripes about how hard life is, as if nobody else goes through anything. It's just, they're the only ones who have it bad. Everybody else just gets up in the morning and goes and plays, and then they're the only ones that actually have to do any work or suffer. And it's like, you just don't want to be around that, and so in your youth, don't get in the habit of living that way. Don't look at life like that, from the standpoint of, all of your problems that you've got to solve. Learn how to, and this is the reason why I got involved in drugs, is because there were so many problems, so many issues that were going on in my life, and I'm just focused on them, rather than just saying, let's just live life, and deal with the problems, but don't worry about them and don't get all caught up in them. And things can change. And so it's much easier to do that as a Christian. Again, I always have to put these disclaimers in. If anybody's ever read any of the things that we put on our descriptions for our content, it's, don't be surprised when I say stuff that sounds anti-Christian, because it's just anti-religious. And having been a pastor around the world and having met all kinds of people, it is amazing to me how many people, they're only happy being miserable. And what a lonely life that is. You'll never meet anybody or you may meet somebody and you might find somebody who will tolerate you, but you won't be able to appreciate them. You won't, because, you know, in your mind, they can never do enough for you. They're always falling short because everything in your life is a problem, and the only time you're ever happy is when you're griping, you know. And so you've got to find the bad things about everybody because you've reprogrammed, like I said, you've reprogrammed your chemical system so that the only time you ever get dopamine is when you're upset about something. And so it's like, you know, it's more technical than that. It's actually cortisol.
Okay.
But you start pumping yourself. You get high on something that's meant to be a pain reliever, you know, rather than something that actually picks you up. So, but anyway, I would say that, you know, don't focus on all the difficulties of life. There's so many difficulties that there's no point in focusing on the difficulties. And the good thing that I find as a Christian is that when I am facing those kinds of things, when there are moments that are really heavy, that I can pray, you know, and I can speak to God and I can find comfort. You know, it may not change the facts of the matter, but I can find comfort and I can find peace, you know, in God. And I know people that can't do that, and they can't do that because the only thing that they can find comfort in is cortisol. You know, they've got to have their body pumping cortisol all the time. You know, eternal pain relief. You know, because they are so geared towards processing every problem all day long.
What else? What else are some things that, like, maybe talk about, you know, from your experience of like things that have been difficult for people to grasp that you've tried to give advice on, you know, as a pastor, as a mentor. What would be some things that like you think people have struggled to grasp?
Well, this is probably going out there, but marriage. You know, one of the things that I have realized over the years, and again, it comes back to that social relationship thing, is marriage. You know, this is my new take on marriage. Marriage is two half people becoming one person. It's not two people becoming one person. It's two half people becoming one person. And the reason why I say that is because when you get married, you are a person, and so are they. And you know very little about them for the most part because you're not married. It isn't until you're married that all of a sudden, you know, there's this weird magic that happens, that all of a sudden things that we didn't do, we now do, and those things are now irritating to the other person. And so a good majority of marriage is learning how to get rid of that part of you that is irritated with your spouse, which means you're going to have to give up stuff. You know, you're not going to change them. You know, you're not going to change your spouse. You are going to have to give up part of who you are if you want to be married. But the cool thing about it is that once you've given that up, you don't miss it. You don't miss it because it's not necessary. It's only if you're selfish. If you're a selfish, self-centered person and you refuse to allow other people to be who they are, then don't get married, you know, because you will get divorced, and you'll probably get divorced more than once. And every time you get divorced, you'll always blame that person. You could marry somebody who's passive and you know, very go with the flow, and you'll hate that. And then you'll meet somebody who's very aggressive and demanding, and you'll hate them as well. You know, there's no satisfying people like you. You can't. There's no satisfying you because you're in your mind. It's just about you and yourself. And if you're not going to be willing to get rid of half of yourself in order to be married to somebody, don't do it. There's just no point. And I've watched over the years. I've seen marriages end in divorce over and over and over again, and it's always the same. One of the common, it's so common it actually has a name, and you just write that down when you're going to fill out a divorce application. It's called irreconcilable differences. You just write down, we're having irreconcilable differences. Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Get divorced. Okay, see ya. Next. Because it's always the thing. And what that means is I'm not going to change, and neither are they.
Yeah.
And that's what it means when it comes right down to it. And so it's like, okay, get divorced. You shouldn't have got married. You shouldn't have brought kids into it, which is the worst thing. Bringing kids into a situation, kids in divorce, it's it affects them. It affects them. If you are the kind of person who says, oh, my parents were divorced and it didn't affect me at all, then you don't probably have any friends or know anybody, because that's not true. It does affect you. It affects you in your psychology. It affects you in your disposition. It affects everything, and it's always negative. It's always because there's it's not the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be able to be married and to live happily ever after, but only if you're willing to become half a person in the process. If you want to keep all of yourself, you can't. It just isn't going to work. And I know that from personal experience because I've been there. I know what that's like. I was having a conversation with a guy yesterday, and I told him, I said, there are times, even as a pastor, even as a Christian, even as somebody who really loves God and wants to have a relationship with God, there would be times in my life where I would think, I just don't want to do this anymore because I'm tired of giving up who I am. I'm just tired of giving up myself. And I realized, you know what? If you're going to be married, this is going to be the case. Whether it's this woman or another woman, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to give up part of yourself. So
do you think that's just like how life is?
It is. It is. You're marrying another human being. This is not. You don't absorb this person into your world. It's not how it works. Both of you have a world. We call it a world view. Everybody has a world view, and hardly anybody has the same world view.
So what about like to the young? Because you mentioned listening more and things that you would do. If you were young, you'd listen more. What are some things like that? Practical things that like maybe even at a younger. I am almost 40. I'm not. I do say it in jest just to mess with my wife, but reality is I do have some history behind me now, and I'm not as young as I was. And so, but there are young people, and truthfully. Maybe this is these could be statements for even folks my age to fill in gaps, things that haven't been absorbed or invested in and gained as their own wisdom that you can add in. Listen more.
Yeah, because I've already
changed.
I've already thrown some of that stuff in there, so it's
No, keep going. I know. The truth is, Pastor Ford, I know when it comes down to it. You could keep going for an entire podcast just giving advice.
Yes, I could.
Keep going.
I could, because I've had such great experiences in life. And when I say great experiences, I don't mean that, like the, some fantasy story of, never having problems, having real problems, real genuine problems. But being a pastor, you have to deal with your problems, or you're not a pastor anymore. You can't, you don't, as a pastor, a real pastor, I'm not talking about a vocation as a pastor, I'm talking about as a real pastor, no matter what the size of your congregation is, there's always people who are looking at you and they want to see that God is real through you. And if you don't deal with things, then you're done as a pastor. And so living with that kind of pressure on you, of knowing that people are looking at you as an example of who Jesus is. I mean, it's like, it's funny, people in the congregation, and I know because I wasn't always a pastor as a Christian, is how easy it is to just not really think too much about how people, when they look at you, what they think about Jesus, and I did think about that, but nowhere near as much as I did that until after I became a pastor. And so I've had, I'm watching, and it's like, I've got I've got to have answers for people. And you cannot give answers to people out of the mistakes you have made. You can't. And I've had this conversation numerous times with people who have had failures. They've done things, they've had failures, and they want to keep going on, and they want to be the teacher, and it's like, no, you're done. You're done teaching. You're done. You can't stand up at the chalkboard and say, okay, don't do this because I did, and this is how it works out. Don't do this because I did it, and this is how it works out. Because people are just going to look at you and go, well, first of all, you're a failure. I don't want to listen to you. And the truth is, it won't happen to me the same way it happened to you. And the reason why they're going to do that is because that's what you did.
Yeah.
You did the exact same thing. You said, nobody can teach me anything. I'm going to do it my own way. It doesn't happen to me. And you're just going to transfer that spirit on them. And so you're doubly wasting your time, because they're not going to take you seriously. They're not going to look at you for advice. They're not going to think that you know anything. They may be respectful. They may tell you thank you for your advice and stuff like that. But if they take your advice, they're going to take it because somebody else said it, not because you said it, because you don't have anything to give them, because you didn't take your own advice. And so you don't want to go there in life. And so you have to be thinking about making the right choices in difficult times. We don't have the luxury of just being able to make stupid choices just because we're so sick of having to deal with things. You have to. No, I don't want my life to be a bad example to other people. And so I think that's a thing, definitely, as a young person, that you need to get in your mind right away, is that other people are going to watch you as you get older. And are you going to be a nothing, a nobody, that people don't pay any attention to? And then you're going to get older, and so I think that's the thing that's probably the most important to understand, is you are eventually going to be older, and you're going to be older longer than you're younger. That's all there is to it. You are going to be older longer than you are younger, but it's going to hit you all of a sudden. You're going to realize, I'm old. Riley gave me a birthday card. Riley's what, 10? 11?
She's 11.
11.
Oh, she's 12. 11. 11. She'll be 12.
Yeah, I was going to say she's not 12 yet. But she, in her card, it says, so you're older. Well, you've always been old to me. And it's like, well, of course I have, because she's only 11 years old. Of course, I remember, I remember being 10 years old and having my dad comb my hair, and my dad, because he used to blow dry my hair when we were younger, and my dad, he was probably about 15 feet tall at that time. I remember him having to reach down to his thigh to comb my hair. He was huge, and old, had a beard, and he was only, at that time, he was only 30 something years old. And then I became 30, and it's like, that's not old at all. But I'm looking, my dad, he's like massively tall, he's old, and and I'm like this big, and it's but you do eventually. And it doesn't take long, you get, when you start hitting 30, you're old, and it's funny, I hear people who, they're 30 years old, and I'm still young, and they try to act like they're 18, and it's like, you're embarrassing yourself.
Yeah, yes.
You're just embarrassing yourself, because nobody looks at you that way.
Yeah.
Some 15-year-old, there's 20-year-old isn't going to look at some 30-year-old and say, "Oh yeah, you're just like me. Let's just go out and go to clubs." It's not like that. It's sad. It's sad. So you're going to be older longer than you're going to be younger. So keep that in mind as you're growing, and you're having these life experiences. You want to learn stuff. You want to become an example to other people with your life, no matter what. And this is true even if you're not going to become a Christian. Becoming a Christian is the ultimate of all of this. But even if you're not going to become a Christian, do you really want to spend your life as a has-been, for years as a has-been? I know people that they hit their 50s and they're has-beens and they're never going to be anything. They're already divorced. All their kids are grown up. They've all moved out. Their kids have no respect for them. Their kids talk about them as if they're their age, and they're 20 years younger than their parents. And it's sad. It's sad to watch that, and you think, man, you know what? You're 50, and I think about my life and think about what I was doing at 50 years old and kind of influence I was having at 50 years old and the impact. And I think I'm so grateful, that I learned at a young age, in my 20s, that I learned how important it was to be thinking of the future, be thinking of who you're going to be in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years.
Very cool. Well, I think that's actually a good place to end. Consider the fact that you're going to be old one day.
Yeah.
We will stop there, and I think it's a good stopping place. Like I said, I meant this to be kind of different, not so topic driven, more general, just conversations from one generation to the next. And so hopefully that was helpful. If you're watching after the fact, we're really glad you took the time to watch or listen to the podcast. As always, we really do encourage you to join live. For those that joined live, we appreciate you guys being a part of the podcast tonight, and we always extend the offer and the information or the invitation for folks to come and be a part of our midweek service or join us on a Sunday morning, Sunday evening. We have 2 services on those days, and we'll put that contact information, address and stuff is on the next page. It'll show up on your screen, and then as always, you can find more information about us on our YouTube page, our website, and we'll be here again next week. We hope you can join.